Thank you, Anna. Last, and I'm sure in terms of all the wonderful speakers you've had here today and yesterday, probably the very least. But it is really a huge honor for me to be here and to be able to represent the World Bank. And it's particularly a privilege to be here following Charlie and what he said. And he was able to say something in a charismatic way that I could never say, which is that as we sit here in Stockholm, and we're all part of the solution, we're coming up with fantastic ideas, and I've listened to brilliant solutions being proposed over the last day and a half. Ultimately, the solutions are going to be found through the blood, sweat, and tears of the smallholders from here in Sweden to Somaliland, who every day are out there trying to make food production work. So the answers aren't found in places like the World Bank, but we like to think we do have a role to play. And so one of the things I want to do this morning very briefly is to just discuss first, why do we care about food? It may seem obvious, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about why and what it is we're doing about it. The bank has two goals. We are committed to ending extreme poverty by 2030 and to sharing prosperity with the bottom 40% in every country. We simply can't do either of those unless we figure out how to deal with food and food production. The poor, the bottom 10% in any country, spend 2/3 of their income on food. That doesn't mean they're spending it on good food. It doesn't mean they're getting enough food, but they are spending 2/3 of their income on food. So that means when we don't get food right, when food prices spike, they're the ones who suffer most. On the other side of it, if we really want to share prosperity and lift up the bottom 40%, we can do it through agriculture better than through any other investment. An investment in agriculture produces 2 to 3 times the return on incomes than any other kind of investment. So it matters. And more than anything else, if we want to reduce and eliminate extreme poverty, if we want to do it while sharing prosperity, we have to do it all while turning down the heat. And we can't turn down the heat unless we think about agriculture. Agriculture today contributes a quarter, a third, in fact. I don't always read my notes right. A third of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's up 14% in the past 10 years. It's expected to grow an additional 30% by 2050. If we don't figure out agriculture and agriculture's footprint, we're never going to reduce climate change. And we're never going to be able to end extreme poverty. But in order to look at this, in order to think about food, we have to think broader than agriculture. So at the bank, we take a very wide-angle lens to thinking about food production. Yes, of course, we work on all things agriculture-related, from thinking about inputs to research. But we also think about those off-farm ecosystem and biodiversity services that underpin productivity on the farm. And that's everything from water to pollinators. How do we do this? That's why the World Bank is actually the largest funder, public funder, of biodiversity conservation globally. It's not just because we care about species and wild spaces, though we do. It's also because we desperately care about agricultural productivity, and we know if we lose biodiversity and ecosystem services, we lose agriculture. It's as simple as that. But we also think about food production in terms of infrastructure, and thinking about how our investments in infrastructure can underpin agricultural production, underpin food production. And that's because access to markets is critical. We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about food waste. An awful lot of food waste happens because farmers don't have access to markets, or the roads wash out. And so a market they thought they had access to one day, they don't have access to the next. So when we think about our infrastructure investments, we think about food production. We think about access to finance, and that being critical for food production. Charlie talked a little bit about women smallholders, and they make up almost 50% of all smallholder farmers. And as he said, they have access to so little compared to their male counterparts. If women's smallholders simply had the same access to finance and other inputs that their male counterparts have, agricultural productivity would rise immediately 30%. So we would get a 30% bump simply through gender equality. That would be 150 million fewer hungry people if we simply allowed women the same rights and the same access to finance as we give men. We also think about our information and communication technology investments and how those can help agriculturalists, help smallholders. How can we get them and give them information, access to information on price, which is something else that drives harvest, when we harvest, how much we harvest, something else that underpins how much or how little waste there can be in the system. So again, at the bank, we don't just think, when we think about food production, we don't just think about agriculture. We think about infrastructure, we think about ICT, we think about conservation, we think about finance. Because for us, the challenge of producing twice as much food between now and 2050 to feed 9 billion people, to go, as we heard yesterday, from seed to stomach with the least waste possible, and to do it in the most nutritious way possible, we have to deal with climate change. For every 1% Celsius degree rise, there's going to be a 5% decrease in cereal production and grain production. That's enormous when we're trying to double production, 1 degree rise in climate change. So we have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with the fact that there are, as we heard yesterday, 2 billion hectares of degraded land that are no good for anything right now. We have to figure out that puzzle. We have to figure out the water problem in places where there are too much and in places where there's too little. How do we figure this problem out? How do we clean up our oceans? We've heard a lot the last couple of days, and I'm very glad to hear we're talking about oceans and fish. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to double production, it can't just be on land. We have to think about sea, both in aquaculture and in the last great hunt that we all are part of through wild capture fisheries. But we have to clean up the oceans to make more of our fisheries. There are dead zones in the oceans the size of New Zealand, and those dead zones are growing. Those are zones like the degraded land, the 2 billion hectares of degraded land, where we can grow nothing, we can catch nothing. There's up to 45,000 pieces of plastic on every square kilometer of ocean. We all saw that when we were watching CNN's constant coverage of the missing Malaysian airline, when one of the things that prevented that airline from being spotted easily was just the sheer amount of debris on the oceans. And think about the effects that is having on fishing. Think about the effects it's having on smallholder fishermen and fisherwomen who are out at sea trying to catch fish for which this plastic, the marine debris, is breaking their gear, is causing huge, huge problems. So we have to think about the challenge of producing food across all of these various sectors. We also have to think about the role of behavioral economics and consumer choices. We've heard a lot about that this last day and a half. And this is where I want to take a moment, because I have a confession to make. So my name is Valerie Hickey, and I like red meat and fried potatoes. It's true. I'm part of the problem. And I think it's important. We've heard a lot this past day and a half from folks who said, I know I'm speaking to the converted. And the truth is, in large measure, we're here because we want to be part of the solution. But some of us have to admit that we still make poor choices. And this is despite having access to the best information in the world. I get to come to conferences like this. I work with some of the best people in the agricultural field. I sit next to one of the best nutritionists we have at the World Bank. So it's not because I don't eat poorly because I don't know any better. I do know better. And I'm Irish. So my genetic coding includes the memory of a famine that killed 1.5 million of my people less than 150 years ago. I do it. I make those poor choices. I overeat, despite the fact that just 1 generation ago, my father went hungry. He was the youngest son of a smallholder family, and he left school when he was 11 because he had to go and work for another farmer, one of the big farmers, because his family simply couldn't put enough food on the table to feed him. So I know intimately, I know genetically, and I know intellectually that good food choices matter. I still don't make them. So that's why when we think about food production, we have to think about agriculture, climate change, infrastructure, finance. We also have to think about those incentives and those regulations that drive better choices, including for people like me who should know better, but don't. So the challenges are great, but I think the solutions are also just as great. And I'm very proud to be part of an institution that has begun to take action on the idea of networks of cooperation, which we all agree are critical to the solution for food production. And we're actually transforming them into coalitions of the working to close the implementation gap. Because at the end of the day, as we've heard this past day and a half, we know what most of the solutions are. And in fact, there's quite a bit of money out there to implement these solutions, but there's still an implementation gap, and we need coalitions of the working who together with the finance and with the right energy can make a difference. And I just want to mention very briefly 3 partnerships, 3 coalitions of the working that we've convened at the World Bank that we think can be part of the solution. The first is called WAVES. It's the Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services Partnership. And this is a partnership that together with the private sector, led by governments, we are looking at how do we value those off-farm services and biodiversity and living natural resources that are so important to GDP, so important to food security, and yet are often invisible in GDP accounts. In Botswana, for example, we're helping the government look at its water and think about the contribution of water to its GDP, particularly to the agricultural sector, as it begins to make trade-offs between its manufacturing and tourism industries and its agricultural industries. Because water is a limiting factor in Botswana, and we're helping them understand what that means in terms of policy trade-offs. A second partnership that we've convened, again with the private sector, is the Global Partnership for Oceans. This is an attempt to bring together all of those actors who are working in the oceans across the habitat, pollution, and fisheries space to begin to take a sustainable oceanscape approach to the problems in the ocean, to begin to align human well-being and ocean health in a way that can guarantee food security and safeguard the livelihoods of those tens of millions of people who depend on fishing for livelihood, of the over 1 billion people who depend on the protein from the seas as their primary source of animal protein every day, just so they don't go hungry. So the Global Partnership for Oceans is again a partnership where we're trying to coordinate investments, coordinate energies, so we can begin to tackle what to many of us still remains the Wild West of development spaces, the ocean. But the partnership that is perhaps the most important, particularly for us here today, is a partnership we have, again with the private sector, called the Global Agriculture Food Security Program, GAFSP. This is a partnership that was convened following a G20 request in 2010 that brings together pooled donor funding as risk capital for some of the poorest countries dealing with some of the stickiest food production and nutrition issues. So together, in the last 3 years, we've committed over $1 billion to countries in order to raise their food production, do it in a way where we're not just talking about quantity, but we're also talking about quality, making sure we're getting nutrition in the bellies of the right people. And we're doing it in a way, again, that looks beyond simply funding agricultural inputs. It's about making agriculture climate-proof. So whatever gains in food production we make are resilient and are sustained. It's about sustaining the broader landscape in which food production gains can only be sustained. Again, if we lose those ecosystem services, those off-farm ecosystem services, we're going to lose any on-farm productivity gains we've made. And it's about introducing new information and communications technologies that gets the right information and the right solutions into the hands of the people who need it most. And we've already had fantastic results through our GAFSP program. In Bangladesh, there are now 400,000 smallholders whose agricultural production is climate-proof. So they are resilient against those external shocks that we know are coming, particularly for countries like Bangladesh. In Rwanda, we've been able to invest, and led by the government, been able to increase incomes twofold, while we've increased yield and food security fourfold within the country. This is incredibly important, and this is a partnership that was just born in 2010, so it doesn't take a long time. It takes concerted effort. It takes turning these networks of cooperation into coalitions of the working. And more than anything, it takes public-private partnerships, because the key to a successful partnership and to real results on the ground from what we've seen over the past decades of working in this space is that if we don't engage the private sector, we simply will not solve this problem. We know that breaking the cycle of poverty and malnutrition will pay lifelong dividends, and we cannot do it at speed and scale unless we engage the private sector. And this makes sense for farmers, who ultimately are going to make more money and avoid the boom and bust of smallholder farming that has cursed the sector for a long time. It makes sense for companies who can invest in supply chains that will be sustained, will be permanent. It makes sense for the public sector, because these sorts of investments and partnerships will grow total wealth, and they'll reduce political instability. And I'm an optimist. We heard a lot today and the last couple of days about the challenges, and there are real challenges, but I am a real optimist, because each shows this more than anything. It's bringing together the right people across the science, business, and public sector space. We're having the right conversation. It's not just about food quantity, but it's also about nutrition. We're talking not just about on-farm productivity gains, but about landscape security, and we're talking about the oceans. And we're talking about it at the right time. So you all know we're in the midst of the post-2015 framework discussions. We're talking about sustainable development goals that will guide development assistance for the next decade. And agriculture, food production is a major part of this. And these kinds of conversations happening now with the right people in the room are driving the results of that discussion. And they're happening in the time when the private sector is finally beginning to bring into the marketplace the financing that has been sitting out the recession. So there's a lot of money waiting on the wings to invest in good ideas. And I think all of the ideas that have been presented over this past day and a half are the right ideas at the right time, spoken by the right people. So thank you very much.